Thanks very much indeed. And particular thanks to Joe. I was grateful to get the invitation to come and talk to you and to the rest of the team here at the school. It's my first time, and I have to say I've enjoyed the last 24 hours so much. I certainly intend to come back as an audience member at next year's MacGill. I think it's a phenomenal event. I suppose, first of all, it struck me when I was asked to come along, given the particular theme of the school, how stands the Republic, but also the theme of this evening's session, it struck me that we both need to perhaps cast an eye backwards a little bit to consider how this idea of a republic emerged in the first instance, and then maybe assess a little bit what we've done with it, and whether or not the ideas that underpin the founding of the republic are relevant today, or whether we've delivered upon that. And I was struck by something I heard about a month ago. Annie Doran was 47 years old when she filled out the 1911 census. She lived in a tenement slum she shared with 9 other families at 24 Gloucester Street, Dublin, just the other side of the Liffey from the Customs House. And over the course of her life, Annie gave birth to 8 children, and only 3 survived. Across the tenements of the inner city at the time, the child mortality rate was over 50%. 26,000 families lived in one-room dwellings. On Henrietta Street, an astonishing 835 people lived in just 15 houses. I learnt all of that from a lecture delivered by President Michael D. Higgins last month that some of you may have heard, remembering the 1913 lockout. And I started to think then about how the poverty and deprivation visible to the men and women who founded our republic, indeed experienced by many of them, drove the writing of what's considered to be one of the 2 founding texts of our republic, the Democratic Programme of the First Thaw. And it says in one passage, "It shall be the first duty of the government of the republic to make provision for the physical, mental and spiritual well-being of the children, to secure that no child shall suffer hunger or cold from lack of food, clothing or shelter, but that all shall be provided with the means and facilities requisite for their proper education and training." And the programme goes on to guarantee the right of every citizen to live a life with dignity, to make it an obligation on the state to guard the health of its people, even to give the government the right to prevent food or necessities from being exported from this country until the needs of the poorest in Irish society are met. Imagine that, a republic that believed that it could not be acceptable to transfer the assets of this society outside of the state until we provided for the poorest within our own society. The language of the democratic programme is, of course, of its time, but what it outlines are what today we would understand as economic and social human rights. The right to adequate income, the right to health, to social security, to food, those kinds of fundamental rights. So almost 3 decades before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and remarkably, 7 decades before the United Nations adopted the UN Conventions of the Rights of the Child, this extraordinary, audacious, fledgling republic, those women and men who founded that republic, embraced these principles as a response to the inequality and murderous poverty that characterised early 20th century Ireland. So their response to the grave crisis Ireland faced at the time was not to replicate a discredited system, but to replace it with something new, a different and better Ireland. They set out that vision in both the proclamation and the democratic programme, but I think we can acknowledge that sadly for us it was a vision never yet fully realised. In reality, I think it's fair to say that something slipped between revolution and statehood. The governments of the Irish Free State did not radically change Ireland, but simply carried on much as before once the crisis of that revolutionary period had ended. Now, of course, there's no comparison between the poverty of that time and life in Ireland today. As difficult as the recession and this economic crisis has been, as much suffering as it has brought, they are different realities. But it does seem to me that we now face that same challenge to radically reimagine and rebuild our society and our political and legal systems. We hear a lot of talk at the moment about the need to regain our sovereignty. Of course we do. But sadly, we hear very little about what we'll do differently when we do so. Will we simply regain our sovereignty and go back to being the state and society we were, the one that led us to this crisis, or will we instead begin to think about the state we might be? A true republic of equals, built upon the principles of fairness, justice and human rights, imagined by those who gave their lives for the foundation of the modern Irish state. To be honest, I really do fear that in Ireland we pay lip service to those ideals, and there's no real indication of that changing at the moment. Our history is littered with broken promises and empty political pledges, from the proclamation and the democratic programme all the way through to the modern era. For example, successive Irish governments have pledged to deliver both social and economic rights outlined in the democratic programme. They have signed and ratified legally binding international human rights treaties that make it a legal as well as a moral obligation on our leaders to fulfil the pledges made to the Irish people in 1919. But then, having signed those treaties, having written those treaties and signed them in partnership with other states, they've dismissed these obligations as mere aspirations, as idealistic. They are not. They are laws written and adopted by states, our own included, which set out not some sort of idealistic, lofty aspiration, but minimum standards. Shouldn't our state at least pay proper regard to the very laws it helped to write? Shouldn't our government place at least equal importance on its legal obligations to people living in this state as it has to the debt it agreed to take on at the behest of the international financial system, the ECB and our European partners? Just imagine again the principle in the first programme from government, that the government should not export assets from outside of the state until it had provided for the needs of the poorest people who lived within the state. There's an example of that principle betrayed in recent times. So we have to boldly rethink our approach to these kinds of questions. It's not enough to aspire to get back to where we were before the economic crisis. If all we aspire to is to return to some imagined halcyon time before the Troika came to Ireland, we've learnt nothing at all. Because, of course, Ireland before the recession was then a deeply unequal and divided society. In 2004, for instance, 20% of people were at risk of poverty. For families headed by lone parents, the figure rose to 2/3. 1 in 4 people who didn't have either medical cards or GP visit cards didn't attend their GP when they were sick because they worried about the cost. In 2004, at the height of the roaring tiger. Our country was run then by a political and financial elite, accountable to no one, that made decisions which shaped and corrupted our economy and our communities, and which saw accountability and transparency as threats to the proper order of things. Bad decision-making which served not the public good, but the selfish needs of various vested interests and powerful elites who were, and if we're to believe what we're seeing over recent weeks, it appears remain above the law, were the reality of that time. So who does the state serve? Who have the governments of our supposed republic served? And equally as important, who have they failed? Those communities marginalised, deprived and ignored today are the same communities who suffered from the same problems before the recession, even if their plight today is more acute. And those who perhaps consider themselves safe, who didn't see a role for the state in their lives, who believed that they could provide for themselves all that they might need, now feel the vulnerability that has so often touched others. And if we could contemplate social and economic rights in the Ireland of 1919, when the notion of self-government for Ireland was a contested one, and when our elected representatives faced imprisonment for the pursuit of national sovereignty, why can't we do the same in the Ireland of today? At a time when it's commonly understood that a lack of transparent, effective and evidence-based decision-making, as well as poor systems of administration and oversight, led us to this place of crisis, shouldn't the overwhelming demand be that we radically change? For example, should we not be looking at putting obligations on the state to protect our fundamental human rights, like health, social security and education, thus ensuring that the primary responsibility of the state is to serve the common good in those areas, as opposed to the muddy and failed old horse trading between various political and other vested interests that we've seen up until now? Now, economic, social and cultural rights are not foreign to our constitutional tradition. We have the education provision in Article 42, we have a particularly well-upheld provision on the right to property, and we have the directive principles of social policy in Article 45. Those are the right of all men and women to an adequate means of livelihood, the safeguarding of the weaker sections of the community, and ensuring the strength and health of workers. But they are directive principles. They're not legally enshrined rights. The fact that they're there, of course, makes it clear that the Constitution envisaged a role for the state in vindicating these rights. They were meant to be part of our political culture. They were supposed to guide our leaders in how they made decisions, allocated resources, and served the people. It's been a failure of our political system to make this happen, and it's where we have a systems failure, politically or administratively, that we must give a role to the courts to defend the rights of our people against the failures of the state. There are those who argue, of course, that we can't afford these rights, that once written into our Constitution, the legendary floodgates will open. But this isn't an argument against protecting those rights. Rather, it's a challenge to the state to understand what those rights mean. Rights agreed, adopted and written into law by those very same states. So putting the right to housing in the Irish Constitution on Thursday, for instance, doesn't mean that on Friday anyone without a house can take the government to court. Human rights law isn't about enriching a generation of barristers. It's about putting a framework in place that promotes accountable decision-making, that obliges a government to say, these are our priorities, these are the rights we're trying to deliver, and here's how we're going to do so the best we can with the money we have available. In economic and social rights, as they are in civil and political, the courts are the last resort. Others argue that economic and social rights are different to civil and political rights because they have resource implications. Of course they do. All human rights have resource implications. So the right to a fair trial requires the state to put in place and fund a functioning criminal justice system. The right to vote necessitates paying for elections, funding political parties, and paying for the salaries of our elected representatives. Nor is this an argument for unlimited public spending. The government already spends money on delivering healthcare, on supporting the housing needs of the population, on providing a system of social protection. But how does it set the priorities for that spending? Is it on the whim of a minister funding an election pledge, or because one section of society was able to shout loudest? And how do we as taxpayers ensure accountability in the delivery of these services? The truth is, we can't. The reality is that our systems of administration are so flawed that the government often cannot even account for how it spends our money. Research carried out for Amnesty International Ireland by Indicon, for example, revealed that the HSE is unable to account for how the mental health budget is spent every year. So human rights law is about how we set our priorities and ensuring that we allocate resources to those priorities in a transparent and accountable way. It's not about taking authority away from our elected representatives or undermining the accountability of our government to us as voters. The responsibility to protect and fulfil our economic and social rights rests with the Oireachtas, not with the courts. But we can learn from the experience of other states where these rights have been inserted into the Constitution or written into an equivalent body of law. The state, in those circumstances, has been made more accountable to the people, not less. The courts have not set themselves above our elected representatives, directing how the country is run and how the money is spent. It's the government's job to respect, protect and fulfil human rights. It's for the courts to step in where there's an alleged failure that where it's alleged that there's been a failure by government. And I won't go into two particular examples. I'll just flag them very quickly. In 2010, there was a German court decision showing how that had to work. The court was asked to rule on the constitutionality of government legislation setting the level of unemployment and child benefits. And the court concluded that provisions of the German constitution gave rise to a right to a minimum subsistence level to ensure human dignity. But the court did not prescribe what the amount was, nor was it for the court to do so. That's the job of the elected representatives, and I wouldn't argue otherwise. But it was for the court to examine whether the processes of determining the level of benefits was needs-orientated, realistic, transparent and evidence-based, that good decisions were made, and that the process took account of the fact that there was a constitutional right to be upheld. Similarly, in Latvia, there's been constitutional court decisions that have also found that the social and economic cultural rights written into the Constitution require evidence-based, objective, transparent decision-making and do not dictate to the executive the amounts of money that they should spend in any particular area. It's important to note then that the courts in those circumstances didn't challenge the right of the government to make cuts, but instead argued in the Latvian case, for example, that other less damaging choices should be made. Governments have to evidence that they've done their very best to avoid making cuts that will negatively affect the rights of people. But if they do so, there was no other choice open to them. To those who argue that provisions on resources and economic decision-making are not for the constitutions nor the courts, I'd also point out that the Irish people voted just a year ago to reject that notion. The EU Fiscal Compact, approved in last year's referendum, contains a requirement on the state to balance the budget. It ties the hand of the executive around how they manage our money, how much money they raise and how much money they spend in broad terms. We're prepared, it seems, to insert these requirements when they're required of us by the European Union, but not to discuss how our constitution could be strengthened to guarantee the rights of the most vulnerable in Irish society. Human rights law is about promoting clear, transparent decision-making, requiring the government to explain why and how it is doing something. It's about good governance. And if that's what's feared, then we have a much larger problem. Accountability should not be a threat to any government. Transparency should not be seen as something dangerous. The further we travel down that road, the more governing in Ireland becomes a conspiracy of the political class whose role is not to serve the people, but to manage them. Not to find ways to meet their needs and their expectations, but to denigrate them. It's an ideology of governance that breeds cynicism and contempt, and one which deserves it. And what of the implications for democracy and for separation of powers should the Constitution set out such rights for the government of the day to vindicate, to be enforced by the judiciary if necessary? The primary role of the policymaker is still held by the executive and the legislator. What is required is that they operate within a set of constitutional parameters where courts may enter and say, this crosses a line, go re-examine and look at what options would not interfere with that right. I'm almost finished. Eamon de Valera famously said in 1934, no longer shall our children like our cattle be brought up for export. But 20 years later, in the 1950s, mass emigration was one of the central features of Irish life. Hundreds of thousands of people left the country and never returned. Those who stayed, who endured, were children that would go through the recession in the 1980s, the return of mass unemployment, of RT filming bars in New York at Christmas time, filled with young Irish women and men in their 20s looking for work. Every time our economy has a crisis like this, we're told that we must knuckle down and go through it, pick up the pieces and try to rebuild, without ever wondering whether we really want to rebuild the system and the society that has faced us so utterly, whether we might want something better, something of which we as citizens could feel a sense of ownership. Economically, we've been through our greatest economic growth and our worst recession in the space of a decade. So we have to ask, what will we do differently this time? The fundamental law of our land dates from 1937. It's a different world today, and we need different rules for it. Successive Irish governments have made their promises to this country. They've promised to fix the health service, improve education standards, get people back to work, ensure everyone has enough to live on. And this government promised universal health care based on need, not income, a basic premise of the right to health. So the intent of the government is there to deliver on these outcomes. The will of the people is clear. More than 80% of people want health and housing rights in our constitution. So put these promises in law. Use them to drive reform. Use them to sustain that delivery over time. Constitutional human rights protections are not handcuffs on the government. They are about establishing a role for the state, a baseline of protection which will be built over time, and a process for good governance. And I promise I'm ending. So just for a moment as I close, imagine what would it look like if, in negotiating the options open to the government in implementing the decisions of the Troika, our government had to balance those demands with obligations enshrined in the Constitution to protect fundamental human rights for people here in Ireland. Irish governments, whatever political composition and in whatever economic circumstances we find ourselves, must understand and be bound by a clear obligation to prioritise the rights of people in this country. Our Constitution values human rights. Our political heritage is littered with calls to arms. Give me 30 seconds and I'll finish it. Our political heritage is littered with call to arms based in the idea of a republic based on fairness, justice and equality. And it's for all of us, our political classes, the media who shape our responses, our judiciary and most of all our people, to recognise that this time we must not simply rebuild. This time we have to do more than look backwards through misty eyes and clap ourselves on the back for the courage and vision of those who died for the birth of an imagined republic. This time, we have to have the courage and vision to radically change and become the republic they dreamt of, the republic our people deserve. And I am sorry for having taken too much time, but I really do want to try and get to the end of that.